Ask most people to name royal family properties, and they'll give you the obvious ones. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, maybe Kensington Palace if they follow royal news. That's 5, maybe 6 properties. The public portfolio. Here's what they won't tell you. The Windsor family controls over 30 properties across Britain. Castles, mansions, estates spanning hundreds of thousands of acres, properties worth billions of pounds, and most of them you've never seen inside. Many you've never even heard of. Some are officially private, though maintained with public money in ways that are never quite explained. Others are crown-owned, but leased to family members under terms that remain confidential. The costs are obscured through complex accounting. The true scale of the property empire is deliberately hidden. Why? Because transparency would raise uncomfortable questions. Questions about cost during a housing crisis. Questions about why one family needs 30 properties. Questions about who really pays for all of this. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is a documented fact obscured by centuries of tradition and modern PR. The properties exist. The secrecy exists. And there are reasons, very specific reasons, why the palace doesn't want you knowing about them. Drop a comment. Did you know the royal family had this many properties? And if you want more investigations into what the powerful don't want discussed, subscribe. These stories don't tell themselves. Let's start with the one property every Brit knows exists, but almost nobody has actually seen: Sandringham House. Sandringham House. The £200 million Christmas secret. Every Christmas, the news shows the same shots of the royal family walking to church at Sandringham, smiling, waving, looking appropriately festive. The message is clear: normal family, normal Christmas, just like yours. Except it's not remotely normal. Because behind those brief photo opportunities lies a 20,000-acre estate that the public has never fully seen. A property purchased privately in 1862 for what would now be approximately £200 million. A working agricultural business, shooting estate, and royal retreat that generates millions annually. All privately owned by the monarch, separate from the crown estate. The house itself contains about 270 rooms, not as large as Buckingham Palace, but still massive by any reasonable standard. Built in the Jacobean style, constantly modified and updated over 160 years, the estate includes multiple other residences: York Cottage, where King George V lived; Park House, Diana's childhood home; and Anmer Hall, which we'll discuss later. Here are the facts they do share. Sandringham sits on the North Norfolk coast. Edward VII bought it as Prince of Wales. Elizabeth II considered it her favorite residence, spending Christmas and part of the winter there every year. The estate generates income through farming and limited tourism. Only the ground floor of the main house and gardens are open to the public, and only during specific months when the family isn't in residence. Here's what they don't publicize: the maintenance costs. Sandringham is privately owned, meaning it doesn't appear in Crown estate accounts. But those 20,000 acres require year-round management. The house requires constant upkeep. Security during royal visits isn't cheap. Where does that money come from? The Duchy of Lancaster, which is technically private but historically accumulated through royal position. The distinction between public and private royal money has always been murky. Then there's the shooting. Sandringham has been a premier game shooting estate for over a century, with pheasant shoots driven game, traditional country pursuits that appeal to a certain demographic and appall another. Prince Philip managed the shoots for decades with notorious intensity. These aren't public events. These are private gatherings for family, friends, and selected guests. What's discussed during those long shooting weekends? Who gets invited? The palace doesn't say. Why isn't more of Sandringham open to the public? The official line is privacy and security. Fair enough. You can't have tourists wandering around while the king celebrates Christmas. But why limit access year-round? Other privately owned historic estates open more extensively. The reality is that full access would reveal the scale, which would show exactly how the other half lives, and would make the normal family Christmas narrative harder to maintain, when you're walking through 270 rooms. There's also the question of succession. Sandringham is privately passed from monarch to monarch, but through mechanisms that avoid inheritance tax, ordinary Britons must pay. The current value is estimated at a minimum of £200 million, likely much higher. When Charles inherited it from Elizabeth, did he pay 40% inheritance tax like everyone else would? No. Royal property transfers happen through special arrangements. The public isn't entitled to the details. Here's the speculation. Sandringham represents what the modern monarchy actually is, a massive property-owning business dressed up as tradition. The limited public access isn't about security. It's about maintaining mystique. If people really saw the full scale of Sandringham, really understood the wealth it represents, the normal family image becomes impossible. The Christmas church photos show just enough. The estate's true scope remains hidden. That's not an accident. That's strategy. Balmoral Castle, Scotland's billion-pound fortress. If Sandringham is the family's winter retreat, Balmoral is their summer fortress. 50,000 acres in the Scottish Highlands, purchased by Queen Victoria in 1852 with private money. The estate where Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022. The numbers are staggering. 50,000 acres is 78 square miles larger than the entire city of Cambridge. The castle itself contains about 150 rooms across multiple buildings. The estate includes working farms, forests, grouse moors, fishing rivers, and numerous estate cottages. Current estimated value, over £1 billion. Victoria fell in love with Balmoral on her first visit in 1848. Soon after, she and Albert bought the estate, demolished the existing castle, and built the current Scottish baronial-style structure at enormous cost. Albert oversaw every detail. The result is imposingly Scottish grey granite, turrets tartan everywhere. It's been the royal family's Scottish base ever since. Here's the public narrative. Balmoral is a beloved private retreat where the family escapes London's pressures. They spend August and September there. Prince Philip loved it. The Queen considered it her true home, where she could be most herself, away from ceremony and protocol. All of that is true. It's also incomplete. Balmoral is closed to the public except for very limited ticketed access to the ballroom and grounds when the family isn't there, about 3 months per year. During the family's residence, the entire estate becomes an impenetrable private domain. Roads are monitored. No photography. The 50,000 acres create a buffer zone larger than many countries. What actually happens during those 8-week stays? The official answer is privacy and relaxation. That's likely true, but it's not complete. Maintaining 50,000 acres isn't cheap. The estate employs around 50 full-time staff year-round, including gamekeepers, gardeners, housekeepers, farmers, and maintenance workers. During a royal residence, security staff adds significantly. The costs run into millions annually. How is this funded? Balmoral is privately owned, theoretically run as a profitable business through tourism, forestry, and farming, but the accounting remains opaque. Estate finances aren't published. Then there's the question of access. Balmoral represents the ultimate royal privilege, 8 weeks annually, where the monarch and family can truly escape public scrutiny. No photo calls except carefully staged ones. No surprise visits. Complete control of the environment. That level of privacy is virtually unprecedented in modern Britain. Most landowners with comparable estates open more extensively to justify tax benefits. The royals don't need to because Balmoral is private. But that privacy is enabled by historical wealth accumulation that happened through a royal position. The distinction matters. There's also what Balmoral represents strategically. Scotland and the monarchy have a complicated history. Balmoral was Victoria's way of embracing Scottish identity, or at least performing it. The tartan, the Highland Games, the deliberate Scottishness of the architecture, it was all about binding Scotland to the crown through cultural symbolism dressed as appreciation. That strategy continues. Royal presence in Scotland legitimizes the union. Balmoral is political even when politics is never mentioned. What's rarely discussed is that while Balmoral is where Elizabeth II died, Charles reportedly prefers Birkhall, a smaller property on the Balmoral estate. The castle itself may see less royal use going forward, but Charles can't sell it. That would be politically disastrous and personally complicated. So Balmoral will likely remain in the family. A £1 billion property used a few weeks annually, closed to the public most of the time, its true costs and purpose obscured. The speculation? Balmoral secrecy isn't just about privacy. It's about avoiding questions regarding cost, necessity, and whether one family should control such massive Scottish landholdings while Scotland debates independence. Opening Balmoral fully would mean acknowledging its scale. Keeping it private and closed means that scale remains abstract. The public knows Balmoral exists. They don't know what it really means. The forgotten and the controversial. 7 miles from Windsor Castle sits a property the royal family barely acknowledges: Fort Belvedere. Built in the 1750s as a Gothic revival folly, it's infamous for one reason. This is where Edward VIII signed his abdication on December 10, 1936. The building itself is modest with about 20 rooms, a triangular tower, and crenellated walls. It sits on the Crown Estate, meaning technically it belongs to the nation, but it's been privately leased since 1955. To whom? The Weston family is currently wealthy Canadian business people. The lease terms are never disclosed. Edward VIII lived there from 1929 to 1936, entertaining Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American whose marriage proposal cost him the throne. After Edward left, Fort Belvedere sat empty for nearly 20 years. Nobody wanted the house associated with the monarchy's greatest scandal. Today, it's leased privately. The Westons pay rent, presumably. But how much? What are the conditions? The Crown Estate doesn't publish individual property details. It exists in an odd limbo: public property, private use, zero transparency. It was briefly considered for William and Kate. Perfect location, secluded on Crown Estate land. They chose Adelaide Cottage instead. Why? The historical baggage. Living where Edward abdicated would invite constant questions about duty and sacrifice. Easier to avoid it entirely. Then there's Frogmore Cottage, built in 1901 on the Windsor estate. Frogmore became internationally controversial when Harry and Meghan moved in 2019. It underwent £4 million in renovations funded by taxpayer money through the sovereign grant. The work was necessary as the building had been divided into 5 staff apartments and needed reconversion. New wiring, plumbing, heating, and structural work. Harry and Meghan moved in April 2019. 10 months later, they announced they were stepping back from royal duties. By March 2020, they'd moved to California. Frogmore sat empty, representing £2.4 million in taxpayer money spent on a house barely used. The backlash was fierce. Harry eventually repaid the renovation costs after intense pressure, but only for construction, not ongoing security and maintenance. Frogmore became a symbol of perceived royal entitlement. After they left, Princess Eugenie moved in briefly, then out. Harry and Meghan retained it as a UK base while living in California, paying rent, supposedly barely using it. Then, in 2023, Charles asked them to vacate entirely. They left. The property has been relet, but to whom? The palace won't say. Why the secrecy? Frogmore is Crown Estate property, technically public, but the allocation terms aren't disclosed. When Harry repaid renovation costs, did that cover everything? What about furnishings, security upgrades, and ongoing maintenance? The accounting was never transparent. The current state is deliberately obscured. It's been released, we're told, but press access is denied. No photos exist. The renovation that cost £2.4 million remains a mystery. These 2 properties, Fort Belvedere and Frogmore, represent different failures. One reminds the family of their greatest constitutional crisis. The other became their most recent PR disaster. Both are hidden for the same reason. Exposure means discussing what the palace prefers to forget. The next generation's estates. The younger royals live differently from their grandparents did, or do they? When William and Kate married in 2011, the Queen gave them Anmer Hall, a 10-bedroom Georgian manor on the Sandringham estate, built in the late 1700s. Substantial grounds, complete privacy. The couple spent between £1.5 and £3 million renovating, funded through the Duchy of Cornwall. They lived there full-time from 2015 to 2017, while William worked as an air ambulance pilot. No official photos of the interior have ever been released. The media is kept at a distance. Even basic renovation details remain undisclosed. For the future King and Queen's country home, the secrecy is remarkable. The official line is that it protects the children's privacy, allowing George, Charlotte, and Louis to grow up without constant photographers. Fair enough, most people support that. But Anmer Hall represents more than simple child protection. It has 10 bedrooms for a family of 5, with full-time staff even when the family isn't there. This is landed gentry life, traditional aristocratic privilege. The renovation costs came from private Duchy of Cornwall income, yet the duchy itself is historically accumulated wealth derived from royal position. The distinction between public and private royal money becomes blurred when private wealth exists because of public office. Security adds another layer. Armed police, surveillance systems, and controlled access accompany visits from the future king. Who pays for this? Security costs for senior royals are never disclosed, officially for safety reasons. Conveniently, this means the public can never audit whether the expenses are justified. Compare this to Charles's approach at Highgrove House in Gloucestershire. He bought it in 1980 through the Duchy of Cornwall for $750,000. Today it is worth over $5 million. The gardens are famous and open to the public by booking during specific months, though the house itself remains private. Charles designed the gardens as models of organic farming and sustainable landscaping. The wildflower meadow and cottage garden are internationally recognized. He is genuinely proud of them and willing to share them in a controlled way. Yet the house has only been seen in carefully selected official photos, with no comprehensive tour or detailed accounting of modifications. The privacy is absolute. When Charles became king, questions arose about whether Highgrove would transfer to William as the new Prince of Wales. Instead, it remained with Charles through a private arrangement that has never been disclosed. The Duchy of Cornwall exists to fund the Prince of Wales, who is now, but Charles retained Highgrove, a duchy asset, for personal use. Presumably, he compensates the duchy, but the terms are unknown. Opening the gardens is strategic. It allows the palace to say Highgrove is not a secret. Visitors can book months ahead during limited hours for substantial fees. You see what Charles chooses to show. You never enter the house. Then there is Birkhall, 15 miles from Balmoral Castle, a white Georgian manor the Queen Mother bought in the 1930s. When she died in 2002, Charles inherited it. This is where he and Camilla spend their Scottish summers now, not the massive Balmoral his mother loved. Birkhall has perhaps 15 to 20 rooms and several thousand acres of grounds, though the exact boundaries are deliberately vague. There are working farms, fishing rivers, and grouse moors. Very few photographs of Birkhall exist. Every few years, the family releases 1 or 2 carefully staged images. There are no interior tours, no documentary access. For a property that has been royal for nearly a century, the information blackout is extraordinary. Birkhall is where Charles and Camilla honeymooned in 2005. It is theirs in a way no other property is unconnected to Diana, not burdened with older history. The secrecy protects that intimacy, but it also raises questions. If the king needs a completely private retreat, does that suggest the other properties are not truly private, that elsewhere he is always performing? 3 properties, 3 generations, the same pattern emerges. Extensive holdings, minimal disclosure, private funding that is not entirely private. The locations change, but the secrecy remains constant. The minor royals' mansions follow a similar theme. Prince Edward, 11th in line to the throne, lives at Bagshot Park in Surrey, a Crown Estate property leased to him for $5 million in 1999 for a 150-year term. Did Edward personally write that check? The arrangement was negotiated between the Crown Estate and the Prince, but the actual terms were never published. Bagshot Park sits on 51 acres. Built in 1879 and rebuilt after a fire in 1913, it originally had 120 rooms, though many are now offices. Edward runs his production company from there. The most famous space is the Indian Billiard Room, a gift from Indian princes in the 1880s, elaborately decorated with carved wood. The Crown Estate maintains the structure, while Edward covers interior maintenance and utilities. What that financial split means in real terms remains unclear because the lease terms are confidential. Why does a minor royal need 57 rooms? The official answer is that he runs a business from home and requires office space. But the simpler reality may be that he lives there because he can, because the Crown Estate owns the property, because he is the king's brother. After all, that is what royals do. Where did the $5 million come from? Edward's personal wealth? The Queen's money and some duchy arrangement? It has never been disclosed. For a transaction involving public property, the lack of transparency is striking. Compare this to Princess Anne. She does not live in a palace but on a working farm at Gatcombe Park in Gloucestershire, 730 acres purchased by the Queen in 1976 as a gift for $750,000. Today, it is worth over $7 million. Anne has lived there for nearly 50 years, raised her children there, and built her reputation as one of the hardest-working royals from a property many Britons have never heard of. The house is Georgian, with around 12 bedrooms, comfortable but not ostentatious. The true asset is the land, cattle, sheep, and arable crops. This is a genuine agricultural business, not decorative countryside. Anne conducts over 500 engagements each year. She is respected, rarely controversial, and lives relatively simply. No palace, no elaborate household, just a working farm. This is what Charles says he wants for a slimmed-down monarchy. Anne has been living that model for decades. Yet Gatcombe still raises questions. If Anne can live on 730 acres with 12 bedrooms, why do others require massive estates? If that is sufficient for a princess, why does Edward need 57 rooms? The complication lies in how Gatcombe was funded. It was purchased with Duchy of Lancaster money, technically private, but historically accumulated through royal position. The transfer avoided inheritance tax and capital gains tax. The property increased in value from $750,000 to over $7 million, while owned by someone who pays no property tax because of her status. Anne might argue that she works harder than almost anyone in Britain and deserves her home. Many would agree. But the arrangement still illustrates how royal wealth can accumulate through mechanisms unavailable to others. Then there's Royal Lodge, the property that makes the whole system look indefensible. A 30-room mansion set within 98 acres of Windsor Great Park, it was once the Queen Mother's home and was leased to Prince Andrew in 2003 for 75 years at just $250 per week, less than many small London studio flats. Despite enormous pressure from King Charles, despite the Virginia Giuffre settlement, and despite being stripped of his titles and royal duties, Andrew refuses to leave. He has dug in, and apparently the king cannot evict him. When Andrew negotiated the lease after his divorce in 2003, the agreement was that he would pay the $250 weekly rent and handle all maintenance and renovations. The house required substantial work, and Andrew reportedly spent around $7.5 million renovating it, supposedly from his own funds. But his known royal income was never large enough to easily explain that sum. Questions remain about where the renovation money came from. Some reports suggest the late Queen may have helped. Others point to undisclosed business arrangements. The funding has never been fully clarified. Then came the scandals, Jeffrey Epstein, the disastrous Beebeke interview, and the reported $12 million settlement with Virginia Giuffre. Andrew's royal life effectively collapsed. He lost his military titles and patronages and no longer performs official duties. He is in practical terms a private citizen who happens to be the king's brother. Charles has reportedly wanted him out, questioning why a disgraced former royal should continue occupying a 30-room mansion on Crown estate land. Frogmore Cottage was offered as a smaller, more appropriate alternative. Andrew refused. The lease provides him with strong legal protection, and breaking it would be complicated and publicly messy. His position may look like stubborn pride, but it is also a rational calculation. There is speculation about whether Andrew holds leverage in the form of sensitive family knowledge, or whether past promises must be honored. The more likely explanation is simpler. The lease is legally sound, and forcing him out would create worse publicity than allowing him to remain. The maintenance costs are another hidden issue. A 30-room estate requires full-time staff, heating, groundskeeping, and constant repairs, potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. Andrew is supposed to cover these costs, yet his visible income appears insufficient, particularly after his settlement. Someone is paying for Royal Lodge's upkeep, but the details are not disclosed. Royal finances, after all, remain largely private. Royal Lodge is just one example among several. Edward resides at Bagshot Park, reportedly under a long lease arrangement. Anne owns Gatcombe Park, purchased in a tax-advantaged way. Andrew occupies Royal Lodge under a lease that shields him from eviction. Different arrangements, but the same underlying reality, royal privilege reinforced by secrecy. Behind it all sits the broader financial structure. The sovereign grant amounted to $86.3 million in 2022-2023, taxpayer money that is publicly accounted for. Annual reports are released, briefings are held, and an appearance of transparency is maintained, yet the full picture is never revealed. Security costs are classified as matters of national security and are not disclosed. Estimates range from $100 million to over $200 million annually. Separate from the sovereign grant and funded through the Home Office and Metropolitan Police budgets. Every property requires protection when royals are in residence at Sandringham at Christmas, Balmoral during the summer, and Anmer Hall during visits. The costs accumulate across more than 30 properties, but the public never sees the total figure. The distinction between Crown estate property and private property further complicates matters. The Crown estate holds assets worth roughly $15.6 billion. It is technically owned by the monarch in right of the Crown but managed independently, with profits going to the Treasury. In exchange, the monarch receives the sovereign grant, currently calculated as a percentage of Crown estate profits. Yet the estate itself was accumulated over centuries through royal authority, lands seized, inherited, or acquired through monarchical power. Labeling it independent today does not erase that origin. When Crown estate properties are leased to family members, as with Edward at Bagshot Park or Andrew at Royal Lodge, the terms are negotiated privately. The public does not know whether these agreements reflect market rates or family concessions. Then there are the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, often described as private estates, but existing solely because of their hereditary royal position. The Duchy of Lancaster provides the monarch's private income, around $24 million annually for Charles. The Duchy of Cornwall funds the Prince of Wales, approximately $23 million annually for William. Neither pays corporation tax, and both are exempt from capital gains tax. Renovations at Highgrove were funded through the duchy's income. William's renovations at Anmer Hall were also funded through duchy resources. These are technically private expenditures, but the wealth itself exists because of public office and enjoys tax treatment unavailable to ordinary citizens. Property maintenance is where many costs remain hidden. Buckingham Palace's 10-year $369 million renovation is publicly funded and openly accounted for as a national building. But Sandringham's upkeep, Balmoral's forestry management, and Highgrove's gardens all require year-round professional maintenance. The duchies release financial summaries, yet detailed property-by-property breakdowns are absent. Staff costs are similarly opaque. The official royal household employs around 500 people, funded through the sovereign grant. But additional staff at private estates, housekeepers, gardeners, gamekeepers, farm managers, and maintenance workers are not included in that accounting. Inheritance adds another layer. In the UK, estates above $325,000 are typically taxed at 40%. However, royal property passes tax-free between monarchs under a 1993 agreement. Private estates such as Sandringham and Balmoral passed from Elizabeth to Charles without inheritance tax and will eventually pass to William the same way. The wealth compounds across generations without taxation. When all these elements are combined with undisclosed security costs, duchy incomes with preferential tax treatment, unmeasured maintenance expenses, staff costs beyond public accounting, and tax-free inheritance, the true cost of the monarchy becomes difficult to calculate. Estimates range from $300 million to over $500 million annually, but no figure can be definitive because key information is not publicly available. Critics argue that full transparency would be politically explosive, revealing the extent to which private and public funds intertwine. Viewed individually, each property can be justified. Sandringham is tradition, Balmoral a retreat, Windsor a working residence. Viewed collectively, the scale is immense. Charles can only reside in one place at a time, yet he has access to Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Clarence House, Sandringham, Balmoral, Berkhall, and Highgrove. William has Kensington Palace, Anmer Hall, and Adelaide Cottage. Anne resides at Gatcombe Park. Edward lives at Bagshot Park. Andrew holds Royal Lodge. More than a dozen major properties are tied to a small number of working royals. At the same time, many young Britons struggle with housing affordability. Rents consume large portions of income, and social housing waiting lists stretch for years. The contrast between one family with access to dozens of residences and millions struggling to secure a single home fuels debate. Charles has spoken of modernizing and slimming down the monarchy, but the property portfolio remains vast. Selling historic estates such as Sandringham is politically and culturally unthinkable. The system persists, shielded by tradition, law, and limited transparency. Been in the family since 1862. Open Balmoral year-round. Eliminates its purpose. Evict Andrew from Royal Lodge. The king apparently can't give up Highgrove. That's Charles's life's work. Each property has defenders, history, and justifications that sound reasonable individually, but collectively they represent a system designed for an era when monarchs ruled rather than reigned, when aristocratic privilege was accepted, when the public had no voice in how royal resources were used. That era is over. The property system remains, and it's increasingly hard to justify. Transparency would force change that the monarchy doesn't want. If every property's costs were published, if every staff salary were disclosed, if every security expense were audited publicly, pressure to reduce would be irresistible. Parliament would face demands to cut funding. The public would demand consolidation. The fiction that the monarchy pays its own way would collapse. So information stays hidden, properties stay in royal hands, costs stay obscured. The public is left guessing about the true scale of the empire they're funding. William faces an impossible situation. He's cultivated a careful image, modern, relatable, and concerned about social issues. He speaks about homelessness and mental health. He presents himself as the monarchy's future, slimmed down, relevant, connected to ordinary concerns. But he's inherited Anmer Hall and has access to multiple palaces. When he becomes king, he'll inherit Sandringham and Balmoral, adding to his substantial holdings. How does he square that with the image he's built? He can't not without real change. Real change would mean giving up properties, opening others completely, and publishing full accounting. The kind of transparency that would strip away mystique and probably reduce public support for the system that gives his family these privileges. The most likely outcome is continuity. William will make symbolic gestures, maybe open one property more, maybe give up one smaller estate, but the core system will remain. The secrecy will continue. The property empire will stay intact because dismantling it would require admitting it shouldn't exist in its current form. The monarchy's property problem may be what ultimately ends the monarchy itself, not scandal, not unpopular individuals, but the slow realization that the system is fundamentally incompatible with modern Britain's values. You can't have 30 properties for one family while nurses use food banks. You can't maintain billion-pound estates privately while the NH crumbles from underfunding. You can't demand public deference while hiding the true costs of privilege. The contradiction grows sharper every year. The palace hopes that by keeping the property empire hidden, by never letting the public see the full scale, they can maintain the current arrangement indefinitely. That worked in Elizabeth's era. She had personal authority to override questions. Charles doesn't have that authority. William won't either. Eventually, someone, probably a future government facing a fiscal crisis, will demand full accounting. They'll publish the complete property list, the total costs, and the funding mechanisms. When the British public sees it laid out clearly, the conversation will shift from, "Do we support the monarchy?" to, "Why do we support this?" The properties the Windsors don't want you to know about aren't hidden because they're scandalous individually. They're hidden because collectively they reveal a system of hereditary privilege that can't survive honest examination. That's the real property problem. And that's why the empire stays hidden, because exposure would force questions the monarchy cannot answer without admitting it's a relic Britain can no longer afford.